Hello, everybody. In Unit 6, we're going to be discussing social institutions and inequality. Now, in order to do so, we want to take a look at institutional spheres. In Learning Module 6, we examine the concept of social institutions. A social institution is ideally a large-scale pattern with which a society organizes itself in order to meet some basic need, collective need, not an individual one. With this definition in mind, however, we need to keep aware of the fact that social institutional arrangements are inherently unequal. Remember last chapter when we discussed institutional discrimination. This inequality is a characteristic of institutional arrangements in sociology. These institutional arrangements are called institutional spheres. Notice the lines in this diagram. I might have missed one in this conceptual diagram, but each of these institutional spheres represents some way in which human beings collectively meet their needs. And these institutional spheres are interrelated. Institutional discrimination, if we examine it through the lens of this diagram, can play out in a way that religion, the economy, the political system, mass media, medicine, and the family are all institutional spheres are organized. What this means is that the social pattern, the ways of organizing resources, inherently favors resource allocation for some groups versus others advantageously. I'll give you some example as we move through a definition of each of these institutional spheres. Conceptually, each of these spheres is interrelated, hence the two-way arrows. For example, if we're talking about access to the abortion procedure in the United States, a pretty controversial topic, then the political and religious systems, or at least parts of them, affect the health system. Here's how to approach understanding these institutional spheres. First, we're going to examine how they function. In an ideal world, each of these institutional spheres would serve equally to allocate resources in a manner that would not systematically benefit one group at the expense of the other. Notice here the words systematic and group. We're again not talking about individuals here, but groups. Notice also the word ideally, which means that there's always going to be a caveat and there's always some sort of challenge or problem associated with these processes. The first and most basic of these institutional spheres is the family. The family is perhaps the oldest of these institutional resources. At one time, the family functioned to provide reproduction, primary socialization of children, care for family and extended family members who could either permanently or temporarily not take care of themselves due to illness or injury, were economic producers. Now a place here resources combined and redistributed among members. All sorts of policies are in place, economic, religious, political, that aim to define the family in terms of constraint. Remember that there is no structural definition of the family. That is, we don't talk about one parent, same sex, two parent, heterosexual, childless, that defines the family in terms of sociology. It is the functions and potential inequalities as well as interactions that define a family. The fight over same-sex marriage is an example of the political and economic institutional spheres affecting the family. By putting constraints on the definition of marriage and family structure, which is historically as much of an economic arrangement as it is a cultural or religious one. The political system is larger than our colloquial definition of politics, so please get that out of your mind for just a moment. Any society, no matter how primitive or complex, has to have some way of meeting collective needs, law, defense, common resources such as water or roads necessary for commerce. The political system is the institutional sphere responsible for this. There are different forms of political systems: monarchies, totalitarianisms, representative democracies. This is a function of the political system, the common good in any society. Inequality comes in when those tasked with the decision making confuse either consciously or indirectly their own interest with those of the members of society. Robert Michel's termed this the iron rule of oligarchy. He thought that people in power inevitably formed an elite, one of the topics you're going to look at in your chapter this unit. In your review of the module for the week, you'll weigh the evidence for a power elite, the term was authored by C. Wright Mills, versus a pluralistic model where different, often competing conditions reach consensus. Religion is another institutional sphere that exerts powerful effect. Note that of 2018, according to the Pew Charitable Trust, the fewest number of Americans identify with any religious tradition than at any time since they started measuring this. In sociology, we are not concerned with religion's comparative ability to explain the unknowable, what happens after we die, if anything, for example, but how it functions as a stabilizing influence in terms of norms, how it bolsters systems of inequality potentially, how it may perpetuate inequality or social justice. We're concerned with religious functions and potential dysfunctions. This affects, for better or worse, Americans who have minority religious traditions or no religious traditions at all. Next, the education system is one that you will consider in this learning module as well. Education, again, must be thought of as a function. Education, of course, begins when one is with one's family before entering the formal education system. This is primary socialization. You might remember from Chapter 3. However, the first encounter an individual has with education as a system organized collectively is in the formal educational setting that is characterized by the school system. The manifest function of this education system is to produce functional adults, but functional for whom and to whose benefit. Education is inherently unequally distributed in the United States due to the manner in which it is funded, through local tax revenues. If your child lives in a comparatively wealthy area, they will receive an education that is both practical and comprehensive. In poor areas, the education may be insufficient to meet the needs of the changes in the economy. Next, the medical system is the institutional sphere that addresses acute and chronic illnesses and tissue morbidities that otherwise can have become problematic to the point that they cannot be treated within the individual household or family. The person is allowed a temporary respite from their normal roles in order to regain function. This is problematic, though, because some economic entities' jobs do not allow for sickness if the job is not considered a core job. And this is coupled with those in these sorts of jobs not having adequate access to necessary resources, comprehensive health insurance policies, in order to become well. Finally, mass media provides at a minimum information that we need but cannot experience directly. You remember perhaps the other day everyone in the United States got a presidential alert. This is an emergency alert, right? You get emergency alerts all the time. All media outlets are, though, controlled and or owned by entities that have varying interests from the audiences that they serve. And the more abstract information that we get, the more problematic it has the potential for becoming. So this is a kind of brief tour of mass media. and the institutional spheres that we're going to be looking at today. So let's look at the module for today. Now that we've gone over social institutions, okay, please read the module overview here. Let's go back to Module 6. You're going to look at institutional reform in terms of, in terms of education, and the poverty, not education crisis in the U.S. would indicate that this is an examination of education and economic spheres, okay? And then you're going to continue to work on your final projects, okay? One thing I left off in terms of our tour of institutional spheres was the economy. That's perhaps the most important one. So before we leave, let me add this on. The economy is the institutional sphere, and I forgot to include it. Economics has a larger meaning than does our usual thinking of it. We need material. When we talk about materialism in sociology, we're not talking about like Madonna, material girl, or materialistic or whatever. That's a colloquial meaning. Do not use the word that way in your discussion. Materialism is the idea that all of these institutional spheres emerge from the need for us to get what we need out of our physical environment in order to live. The economic institutional sphere is perhaps the most important one, and I left it off for some reason. If we talk of technology is anything that human beings manipulate. Air conditioning units have enabled us to live in every part of the world. We can live in space. We can even live in, on the moon, because we're able to manipulate, the physical environment. So the economy is the way in which what we need in terms of both goods, that's, actual material stuff, and services, actions, are produced, distributed, and consumed in a kind of collective way. We have money. We have a advanced capitalist society based on money and so forth, right? And income. So that's an institutional sphere that probably affects all else. I almost left it off. So when we talk about a poverty, not education crisis in the U.S., we're talking about the economic and educational institutional spheres. Okay, so please read this and communicate with me if you have any questions. Thank you.